The Republic of Texas, as we have seen, the tensions between the central government of Mexico City, led by Santa Anna, and the Texans had resulted in the Texas Revolution, March 1835 to April 1836. Um, the revolution really can be summarized in two phrases. One, the Texans running what was the Mexican army out of Texas with the first the Battle of Gonzales, the Lexington, Texas, and followed by the Alamo and the 4-day battle there, and General Acosta's force retreating. And then the second part, Santa Anna coming back with enhanced armies, with more men, and of course the siege of the Alamo, the 13 days to glory, which at least slowed Santa Anna down and severely injured part of his army, so he was not able to take his full force with him. Of course, by that time, Texas had declared independence on March 2nd with the Texas Declaration of Independence on Washington and Brazos. And Sam Houston, of course, was raising up and training a new army for Texas. And then we saw how the Texans ran away, the civilians ran away in the runaway scrape, how the Texas Army retreated back towards the eastern border, the Sabine River. But Sam Houston, looking for a space where he could ambush Santa Anna, and he found that place at San Jacinto. In a battle lasting 18 minutes, defeated the Mexican army and captured Santa Anna. So that secured the political aspect, adopting the Texas Declaration of Independence and declaring independence. You know, you can say a lot of things, but simply saying them doesn't actually get the job done. But Sam Houston and Val San Jacinto got the job done, and Texas independence was more or less secured. The Republic of Texas is born. That is, it's going to be independent of Mexico and independent of, at this time, the United States. Sam Houston being the hero of the Alamo, the Texas government, the Constitution they wrote at Washington and Brazos is very similar to the U.S. Constitution, the fact that it called for 3 branches of government: the judicial branch, headed up by a Supreme Court, legislative branch, headed up by Congress, usually in 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then an executive branch to enforce the law, headed by the president, in this case, the president of Texas. And so Sam Houston, being the hero, was elected the first president of the Republic of Texas. The cavalry officer in charge of the cavalry units at San Jacinto also became a hero. His name was Mirabeau B. Lamar, B for Bonaparte, very famous French general. So Mirabeau B. Lamar became vice president, and Stephen F. Austin, although he was getting a little older and not in good health, he became the Secretary of State, basically to deal with foreign countries during the Republic of Texas period, and some other leaders as well that Sam Houston appointed to help run the Republic of Texas. So the new republic had a lot of problems. First and foremost, I guess, were probably the problems of getting some recognition, that the new Mexican government did not recognize Texas, still considered it part of Mexico, which would probably lead to more invasions and more military problems. But you also had the financial problems. You also had Texas was heavily in debt because of the war with Mexico. Wars cost money, and certainly Texas was in debt. And then, of course, you had the people in Texas, some of whom had really not wanted to become independent, especially many Tejanos who had not been thrilled with the aspect of being independent from Mexico, although, of course, many of these Tejanos had been neutral during the war because it was sort of dangerous to take sides because you didn't know who was going to win. But that certainly was another problem, along with some other problems, including the Indians of Texas and some other problems as well. So Houston and his new administration had many problems to solve. And perhaps one of the first problems to solve is where are you going to meet? Where's this new government of Texas going to meet? After all, if you have a new independent Texas, you're going to have a new capital city. And even though Texans had several sites like San Felipe and Washington on the Brazos they had used, what comes about is that some mercantile brothers, some business partners, some brothers, John and Augustus Allen, were going to build a new town here in Texas, and they hoped that they could get people to move that town. And of course, if people moved to that new town they were building, then those people would pay these brothers, the Allen brothers, money for the land. And so the Allen brothers wanted people to move to the area. So the Allen brothers decided to basically take advantage of what had happened. And so knowing that Texas needed a new capital city, the Allen brothers said, hey, if you move to our new city, we will build this new, like, nice little capital place for you, and the government won't have to pay for it. And we'll even name it after the hero of San Jacinto, Sam Houston. So under Sam Houston's term, the capital city of Texas was at Houston. Although many people complained about the log structures, the muddy street, the heat, humidity, and mosquitoes, after all, it was a new city. They were just in the process of building it yet. And so there were many problems related to building a new city, but also, of course, problems related to the area that we live in that does have high heat and humidity and mosquitoes, and seems like in some parts of the year that we have, of course, rainstorms that seem like they could wash you away very quickly. So the problems that we still have with the weather and climate, they had back then, plus they had the problems of building the new city in the first place. So the town of Houston remained the capital city of Texas throughout Houston's first administration. But mainly, as Houston took office, his real priority was to get the United States to annex Texas, to take over Texas. Since most people in Texas were Anglos from the United States, it only made sense that they would want to join the United States now that they had left Mexico. Having said that, however, and even though Texans voted to not only appoint Sam Houston as their first president, elect Sam Houston as their first president, but also there was a majority of Texans who voted to seek annexation to join with the United States. Even though Texas wanted to join the United States, the United States wasn't quite so sure, because there was that debt that Texas owed. And if Texas joined the United States would have to pay off that $1.7 million debt that Texas owed to its creditors. Besides which, also that because Mexico did not recognize Texas, that seemed that, of course, there might be some more military conflicts, and that means the United States would have to use their army to defend Texas. Besides all that, slavery had been legalized in Texas during these elections, and that really divided the United States, especially at this time in the United States. There's a lot of debate about between the slave states and the free states, about not wanting to add more slave territory to the United States. Many Americans believed that slavery was a very negative evil that had been brought in by the British, and that once the United States declared their independence, many northern states started to get away with slavery. Even some southern states started to thinking about doing away with slavery. But by the 1830s, the Southerners had basically decided to keep their slaves for economic reasons and for some other reasons. And so the United States was basically being divided into two groups, those that really opposed slavery, especially opposed the spread of slavery. Because most people in the United States felt that if you could just contain slavery, eventually slavery would die away on its own. So you don't want to add more territory to the slave areas, that's for sure. So all these problems would prevent the United States from annexing Texas. There was another theory, of course, at the time, that it was basically the United States sort of a God-given idea that the United States should stretch from sea to shining sea. That is, the United States beginning on the East Coast, the Atlantic coast, would spread all the way to the Pacific coast. So there was a group in the United States who certainly didn't want to annex Texas, regardless of whether it was slave territory or not. One of those ideas being that Texas would be, of course, help the United States spread from sea to shining sea, that manifest destiny. Manifest means clearly seen, and your destiny means your future. So the clearly seen future of the United States for some people was, again, to spread from coast to coast, and Texas would simply be part of that. However, in 1837, the United States rejected Texas' proposal to become a state. Again, because of those really three main problems: the debt that the United States would have to pay off when Texas joined, the problem with Mexico that it might lead to another war, and the dispute over slavery were the three major reasons Texas was rejected by the United States. But in 1837, the United States did recognize Texas as an independent country. It did recognize that Texas was not part of Mexico anymore, but was its own country. But the United States would not go the step further that many Texans wanted and actually take it over. So first of all, as the United States rejected Texas, Houston and others recognized that we needed to make, or they needed to make Texas a better place, so the United States would want to take it over one day. So that would mean basically paying off the debt, basically having peaceful relations with Mexico, and perhaps doing some other things that would make Texas more attractive to the United States. So when Houston began his presidency, Texas was over $1 million in debt. Houston was a great money manager, and he did manage to keep government expenses to a minimum, although they would grow during his 2 years in office to about $1.6 million or so in debt. Also, there was talk of actually having a Texas Navy, but Sam Houston refused to build the Navy during this time period, simply because navies cost money, and he again wanted to pay down the debt. He didn't want any more debt. The Texas government then, by act of the Texas legislature, then started to collect customs duties. That is, things coming into Texas were taxed, and also property was going to be taxed. So this money would be used to pay down the debt and run the government. In 1837, the Texas Congress authorized Houston to issue about $600,000 in promissory note called Star money, but the money was really not backed by any gold or silver. So you basically just had to, the money was printed on paper, and it said it was worth $100, or said it was worth $500, or it said it was worth $50. But many people weren't quite sure whether that was true or not. Because it wasn't like you could go to the bank and get $50 worth of gold for your money if you had a $50 bill from Texas. You would hope that someone would accept your $50 bill for $50 in services, but you couldn't quite be too sure. So almost immediately, a lot of Texas money was actually refused by most people. Meanwhile, even though Mexico was still somewhat hostile to the United States, Sam Houston recognized the Army could be a problem, and certainly you don't want the Army to go off and attack Mexico and bring another Mexican invasion upon Texas. But also, armies cost money, and so Houston decided he could save some money and save some frustration, basically by sort of laying off the Army, basically by saying sending the entire Army home except for maybe 600 soldiers, so you had at least a few troops in case something happened. So basically, he refused to build a Navy, he laid off the Army, he tried to pay down the debt. He also tried to make peace with the Native Americans, the Indians living in Texas, because again, if you can make peace with groups, you don't actually have to use your army to fight those groups, and all of that saves you money. So peaceful relations are almost always cheaper than non-peaceful relations. So Houston, during the Texas Revolutionary War, Houston had signed a treaty with the Cherokees. So the Cherokees basically remained neutral during the Mexican-Texan War. And in return, at the end of the war, Texas promised that the Cherokees would get titles to the land. That is, the Cherokees could continue to live on the land they had in Texas, and Texas would officially recognize that it was Indian land. And even though Houston was very sympathetic to Native Americans, many people in Texas were not very sympathetic. Uh, and So during these first couple of years, Houston was busy trying to pay off the debt, trying to make peace with Mexico. He did keep about 600 soldiers, but he also reauthorized the Rangers, which had been a scouting unit of the Texas Army during the war with Mexico, and basically the Rangers basically were for free or very little money. And Houston figured he could use those Texas Rangers sort of in the place of the Texas Army. So the Texas Rangers, who had really their start with the war with Mexico, became very prominent, became very important in Houston's planning during his first 2 years in office, and he used them to basically control criminal activity in Texas, but also as a deterrent against the Mexican invasion. But under the new Texas Constitution, a president could only serve 2 years in office, and he couldn't serve another 2 years right after himself. So after Houston's 2 years was up, Texans held another election, and this time, because Houston could not be president again, they elected the vice president, Mayor B. Lamar. And Mayor B. Lamar, when he took over, had a different vision of Texas. Houston's vision of Texas was basically to get Texas ready to be annexed or taken over by the United States government. Lamar's vision was to not only keep Texas independent, but actually to make Texas even bigger than it was. So Texas would actually stretch from sea to shining sea. That Texas was basically stretched from perhaps the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So under Lamar, not going to be quite the same as under Houston. So again, summary of Houston: Sam Houston worked to keep peaceful relations with Native Americans. He tried to keep peaceful relations with Mexico. He spent as little money as possible, and he promoted annexation of Texas to the United States. But then comes Mayor B. Lamar. Mayor B. Lamar was somewhat hostile, to say the least, to Native Americans. He again wanted Texas to remain independent and expand its territory. He was hopeful that Mexico would recognize Texas, but he wasn't opposed to actually fighting Mexico again for them to recognize that Texas was an independent country. So all this meant almost immediately that there was going to be an increase in the amount of money you're going to spend as far as the Texas government is concerned. So basically, Lamar wanted all the Indians out of Texas, and he used the Texas Rangers to raid the Cherokees and Comanches land. The Cherokees, Chief Bowles, who Sam Houston had negotiated treaties with and who had worked well with Houston, he was killed, and the Cherokees were eventually forced to leave Texas and move into Oklahoma because of the military that Lamar used against the Indians. And of course, wars cost money. Even Indian wars cost money, so that's just going to, help run up the debt. Of course, it's also going to leave a lot of Indians mad at the government of Texas, who were willing to remain peaceful before. Now those Indians are not going to be very peaceful. Meanwhile, the relations with Mexico are governed by the Treaty of Velasco. Of course, we left Sam Houston on the San Jacinto battlefield being wounded, and of course, he basically keeps Santa Anna alive, so Santa Anna can sign these documents that order Mexican armies out of Texas and basically make Texas independent. Meanwhile, Sam Houston has gone back to the United States after San Jacinto to get some medical treatment. He'll be back, obviously, because he's the first president of Texas. But the Treaties of Velasco basically set the border of Texas at the Rio Grande with Mexico. And basically, when Santa Anna ordered the armies out of Texas, he ordered them to cross over the Rio Grande River. So Texans just assumed that the border now between Texas and Mexico was the Rio Grande River. That's what Lamar assumed. The Mexican government, however, still the Neches River was still their border between what had been the state of Texas when it was a Mexican state, in the state of Coahuila. So Coahuila y Texas, the Texas border had been at the Neches River, and so the Mexicans still considered that the border of Texas at the Neches River, while Texas considered its border at the Rio Grande River. Even worse for Texas, I guess, as far as money-wise is concerned, that Lamar assumed that because the Rio Grande River was the border, that all the Rio Grande River was the border, and that meant not just the Rio Grande River that we know and Texas that we know, but that where it starts in the mountains of the Rocky Mountains, and as it runs south, all of that Rio Grande River was also part of Texas, he believed. And that meant that basically half of what we now know as New Mexico would be part of Texas. And to make sure that the people that were living in New Mexico realized they were now part of Texas, Lamar authorized a military expedition called the Santa Fe expedition to go actually to Santa Fe, which was really the only major city in New Mexico at the time, and basically take it over. So he sent an expedition to Santa Fe to convince the people there that they were now part of Texas. Not exactly sure if anyone told him or not, or whether he didn't realize, but there's a lot of desert between East Texas and New Mexico. There's a large portion of West Texas is sort of desert area, and a large portion of the New Mexico is desert area, and so these Texas troops basically were marching across a desert. And they didn't take enough supplies, and they didn't have enough equipment with them. So basically, when they arrived at Santa Fe, they were basically just starving. And the Mexican authorities at Santa Fe basically said, "Oh yeah, come on in, we'll feed you in our jails," and they threw them in jail. So obviously, this only increases tensions between Texas and Mexico. Because even if maybe Texas, even if Mexico had been willing to recognize that Texas was now independent, and maybe even stretch the Rio Grande River in what we now know as modern Texas, they certainly were not willing to give up, half of what we now know as New Mexico. And so this simply increased tensions between Texas and New Mexico. The expedition failed. The money that was spent was basically wasted. And then Lamar, basically, because he had some run-ins with Houston and their personalities clashed, and also because he wanted Texans to feel that they were moving west, that Texans would not just remain in the eastern part of Texas, but move west for this larger Texas that would stretch all the Pacific Ocean. So obviously you need a new capital. You don't want your capital city at Houston, because Houston reminds you, if you're in Texas, that you're basically stuck in East Texas. So Lamar wants a capital city that's further west. And he finds one along the Colorado River at a place called Waterloo, the town of Waterloo. And he will rename that place for Stephen L. Foster, who basically now has died during this time period. And he renames this place Austin, Texas, and he starts moving the capital there. He moves basically the state paperwork, the official deeds and records of Texas from Houston to Austin. So the capital city was named in honor of Stephen F. Austin. Meanwhile, also, Lamar is asking, because he wants Texas to remain independent, he knows that there's a lot of things that an independent nation needs, including a public education system. So Lamar actually asked the legislature of Texas, the ones that can actually pass the laws. Lamar's the president. He's not a dictator. We have to remember that Americans didn't like, and especially Texans didn't like dictators at the time because of what had happened with Santa Anna. So the last thing they wanted was a president of Texas behaving like a dictator. And that meant that the laws that Texans made were made in the legislative branch, the House and Senate of Texas. And Lamar asked the House and Senate to basically make a law that he believed would help further education in Texas. And so the Texas Congress set aside about 18,000 acres of land in each county for public schools. So the land that they set aside, you could either build your school on that land, or you could sell that land and then use that land in your county to build a school for the students, for the young people in your county. And so every county was going to get a public school. The Texas Congress also set aside over 220,000 acres for 2 universities. That would, of course, one of them later would become the University of Texas. And so for asking the Texas Congress to do this, sometimes Lamar is known as the father of education in Texas. He never really built a school, and there was never any law during the Republican period that said you actually had to go to school. But he was sort of forward-looking in this regard, that he believed that every young person should be able to get an education if they wanted one. And that's why he's known as the father of education in Texas. Unfortunately, of course, all of his wonderful ideas actually cost money. And the financial situation in Texas worsened under Lamar. So Lamar came up with some new money, which he called redbacks, because the back of the money was sort of reddish. And these were to replace the Texas currency that were already in place. But because he spent so much money, even these redback bills became sort of worthless after a while. Obviously, he spent a lot of money on battles with Native Americans. He spent a lot of money on the Santa Fe expedition. And during his time, basically, the debt rose from $1.6 million to $7 million in his 2-year period of being in Texas, as being Texas president. By this time, his 2-year period is over. Sam Houston runs again for president. Obviously, he's going to be elected because he's a hero of San Jacinto. And again, his vision is the same. His vision is pay down the debt, rebuild Texas, make peace, and hopefully the United States would annex Texas. So again, he still wanted to prevent war with Mexico. He wanted to spend a lot of money. He wanted to join the United States. And of course, most people in Texas wanted the same thing that Houston wanted. So he wasted no time in putting his plans back into action. He tried to sell the Navy of Texas, and he again reduced the size of the Army, basically fired all the Army guys, and again used those Texas Rangers instead. And spent less than about $500,000 in the next 2 years, as opposed to Lamar spending about $5+ million in his 2 years. So during this time period, again, one of Houston's concerns was trying to keep the peace with Mexico, trying to get Mexico to recognize Texas, because again, wars cost money, and again, if Mexico recognized Texas, then the United States might take over Texas and annex us. So unfortunately, Houston and Lamar had problems with this regard because the Mexican government never recognized that Texas was independent. And twice Mexico sent expeditions into Texas, and one time they actually recaptured San Antonio, but the Mexican army they sent was not very large and didn't have many supplies, so it could not stay for very many days. But they did sort of recapture it for a few days, and then they had to leave again. And after the second expedition into Texas, the Mexican army basically sort of retreated towards Mexico with about 70 hostages, hoping that the Texas Rangers and the militias of Texas would not gather around and try to wipe them out as they left. Sam Houston sent militia forces to pursue the Mexican troops. The Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande River into Mexico, and the sort of the leader of the Texas militia stopped at the border. He did not go over the Rio Grande River because he believed his orders from Sam Houston did not allow him to pursue the Mexican army into Mexico. However, some of the Texans that were with this group were still really mad that the Mexicans had taken a hostage. They were really mad the Mexicans had invaded, and they wanted to invade Mexico. And so about 300 of them decided to invade a nearby Texas city, the near city of Mir, and so they elected a different leader, because obviously the militia leader Sam Houston appointed is not going to invade Mexico. So these 300 guys elect somebody else to lead them into and capture this city, and so they invade Mexico, these 300 Texans, and basically demand that the citizens of Mir, a small Mexican town, provide them with supplies. What they did not know was that there's a large army nearby, a large Mexican army, and while these Texan troops waited for the civilians to give them their food, the Mexican troops arrived and captured the Texans. And these 300 Texans from the Amir expedition were actually taken to Mexico City. And there at Mexico City, basically Santa Anna, who was back in power, ordered a decimation. He ordered that 1 out of every 10 of these Texan soldiers that had been captured inside of Mexico be executed, be killed. And as such, the soldiers passed around some bag of beans, so to speak, and basically the beans that had not white beans meant that you lived. And if you drew a black bean, that means you died. So about 1/10 of these guys in Mexican custody drew the black bean, and they were executed in Mexico City. The other survivors were eventually released in 1844. Meanwhile, President Houston is still trying to get Texas accepted as a state in the United States. (1844) was an election year in the United States. And the outcome of that election, at least one of the candidates running, was in favor of annexing Texas, and that candidate won. However, even as now, we know we hold elections for president, but there's a time period between the time you're elected president and the time the new president takes over. So during this time period, the old president, John Tyler, when he realized that the American people wanted Texas brought in the United States, he proposed a treaty. He made a treaty with the Republic of Texas. And however, in the Senate, this treaty was rejected. Again, basically because of the slavery issue, basically because a lot of Americans didn't want to add more slave territory. Just about this time, Sam Houston's 2-year term was up, and again, he can't run again right after himself. So Texans elect a guy named Anson Jones, who's a doctor and a close personal friend of Sam Houston. So they can't elect Sam Houston, but basically Sam Houston says, hey, elect my friend, and Texans elect his friend, Dr. Anson Jones. So Dr. Anson Jones, again, gets together with, through the Texas Secretary of State, gets together with the American Secretary of State, and they work out an agreement whereby the United States can pass a law to bring in Texas. In the Senate, you have to have 2/3, that is 67% of the senators to agree to a treaty before a treaty can actually become a law. And one of the reasons Texas was rejected in the Senate was they didn't have 67% of the senators on their side. They had over 50%, but they didn't have 67. However, just to make a regular law in the United States, all you need is 50% of the House of Representatives plus 50% plus 1 of the Senate. You just need over half the Senate plus over half the representatives. And so the United States and Texas worked out basically a law to bring Texas into the United States. And because you just had to have just over 50% of the House and 50% of the Senate, that law was passed, and Texas, by joint resolution, a law, became the 28th state in the United States. So the Republic of Texas period, you have basically, and oftentimes we remember the Republic of Texas period by the presidents. We have Sam Houston for a 2-year term, who's trying to pay down the debt and trying to work out everything peacefully to get the Texas annexed. Then we have Mayor Boobie Lamar, who wants Texas to be its own country forever and basically be even almost as big as the United States, and he spends a lot of money trying to do that, but fails. Then we have Houston coming back and basically trying to pay down the debt again, and basically trying to make Texas attractive to the United States again. And then finally, that all pays off under the 4th president of Texas, Anson B. Jones. And that's basically how we remember the Republic of Texas period. So eventually, Texas, after, and again, it's sort of how you'd like to remember this, how So the law that brought Texas into the United States was okayed by the Texas Congress in October 1845 and by the U.S. Congress in December of 1845. The actual turning over of Texas, the ceremony actually occurred on February 19th, 1846. So if you like to think about 1836 in April, when we got our independence from Mexico with Battle of San Jacinto, so that's basically sort of a 10-year period from 1836 to 1846. So Texas was basically its own country for about 10 years.